Welcome everyone. We to an Olga and Isa Ragusa Foundation for the Humanities conversation on Italian and international culture. Our topic today is entitled, our conversation today with Theo Barolini is entitled Breaking the Code, Dante Beyond Commemorations. And this conversation is with Teodolinda Barolini, Lorenzo da Ponte, Professor of Italian at Columbia University. Professor Barolini needs no presentation to anyone who studies who is in Italian studies or is a medievalist and studies Dante, knows Professor Barolini. She is one of the most prominent and recognized scholars of Dante. She's the author, amongst other books, of Dante's Poets, Textuality and Truth in the Comedy, published in 1984, Princeton University Press. The Undivine Comedy, De Theologizing Dante, Princeton University Press, 1992. Dante and the Origins of Italian Literature Culture, published by Fordham University Press in 2007. Dante's Lyric Poetry, Lyrics of Youth and of the Vita Nova, with a commentary. It's an edition and a commentary published by University of Toronto Press in 2014. There is also an Italian edition of this book, as well as, and to me this is also extremely important, she's the author of the Commento Baroliniano, the first digital commentary to the Commedia, to the Divina Commedia, which is published digitally by Columbia University. Professor Barolini is a member of the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the Medieval Academy of America, as well as the Italian National Academy, the Accademia dei Lincei, all nominations that confirm her remarkable success as one of the major scholars of Italian medieval studies. And of course, here we're talking about Dante today, but we don't have to forget Professor Barolini is also one of the most important scholars and expert of Boccaccio and Petrarch as well. I forgot to say that I'm Andrea Ciccarelli, the president of the Ragusa Foundation, but it's less important, of course. And I'm delighted today to have Theo Barolini with us because, not only because of her distinguished career, but because of her strong connection to Olga Ragusa, together with her sister Isa, the namesake of the foundation. Dr. Barolini earned her PhD in the Italian department at Columbia University, where Olga Ragusa taught for many decades and where she was a professor when Professor Barolini received a PhD. Furthermore, Theo Barolini holds the title of Lorenzo da Ponte Professor, as I've just said, a title held by Olga Ragusa as well. So there are many, many connections, of course, and this makes even stronger, makes me even happier to have Professor Barolini with us today. Our conversation is entitled Breaking the Code.
May I just say that Professor Ragusa was an absolute icon, and to me, studying with her was of the greatest value. She exemplified a certain kind of rigor that I have always aspired to. But let me also say that it was very intelligent of her to want you to be the director of the foundation in her name. And I think it's beautiful that you have taken on the challenges and the responsibilities associated with that position. And I hope that you have a very long and successful career with this foundation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate that very much. And now, of course, I'm blushing, but thank you, Theo. Our conversation is entitled, and I'm also very happy that one of the first conversations that we're having with a person from Colombia who understands and appreciates the work of Olga Ragusa. Our conversation, I was saying, is entitled Breaking the Code, Beyond Commemorations, for two reasons. First, Dante is one of those classics who break the code of time, breaching through cultural barriers, surviving intellectual fashions and societal changes, as his works, the Commedia in particular, touch upon most of the issues that we keep debating and updating today. The second reason is that celebratory events rarely spread new knowledge about an author, something that, in case, usually happens in small, well-thought endeavors destined to specialists. Nonetheless, the anniversary has indeed produced new important editions. The anniversary that had just ended in 2021, 700 years of Dante's birth, from Dante's birth. And I was saying, nonetheless, this anniversary has produced new important editions, books about Dante, academic conferences, as well as artistic works and performances, variously in depth to or inspired by Dante's works. You have been a protagonist of the most important and original of these editorial enterprises and conferences. What is your general idea and assessment of these events in terms of scholarly achievements, as well as potential new attention to Dante's works?
Thank you for that question. I think we have to be realistic that for those of us who are in the field, we were looking forward to this centennial for such a long time. And for such a long time, 2021 was a niche year, which meant the Dante centennial, and history overtook that. And in many ways, it simply was not what we hoped for. I mean, that's obvious. All the wonderful opportunities on Zoom do not create the same camaraderie and excitement that happen when you go, as we were all planning to do, to many conferences. So it was an unusual, and that will be the only one that I will experience, I think. No, I guess maybe I could make it to 2020. No, I'm not going to make it till the next one. The next one is not till 2065. I was thinking 2021 was the next one. I got confused there.
Hopefully we will.
Well, maybe you will. But anyway, the point I'm making here is simply that it was a difficult experience in many ways. What I took from it was that the best use of a centennial, at least this one, was consolidation and education. And for me personally, I found that I subordinated the kind of more technical work that I am kind of pursuing in my most scholarly side of my life to talking to people about issues that I've thought about for a long time that are not as much what I'm currently working on, though in some ways I always am. But going back to topics like Dante, Scrittore delle Donne, which I did as a keynote at Ravenna, or Dante gli Altri, which I did in various venues, because of the fact that there was an opportunity to, the centennial gives an opportunity that I don't think we cannot take. So to speak to more people, basically.
Thank you. Thank you. That is obviously very wise and very true. And by the way, you have been involved, if I'm not wrong, also with some editions, some editorial work with in cooperation with other scholars. Am I right about that? Or
I don't really. I personally can't think that I did any edition other than my commentary to the lyrics.
Right.
What were you thinking of?
No, didn't you have a project also in doing conferences with NYU? And,
yes. So that the NYU set of conferences, which was every one of Dante's works, had its own conference starting in 2015, and we were going to culminate in 2021 with the Commedia. We haven't yet had that conference. It's now scheduled for this April. Whether or not we can hold it in person this April, I don't know. But yeah, what was unique about those conferences was that every one of the minor works had its own event, very unusual. And so we did invite editors of the Questio, editors of the Vita Nuova. We did invite the most recent editors. And you know, in Italy, we had both the Mondadori and the Salerno editions in these recent years. So there's a lot of editors around. So that we did try to put the philological questions also on the table. So I do think which is another way of saying that a lot of the excitement of the centennial really was in the buildup to the centennial, those monumental editions, that was all. And from that point of view, nothing was lost, because there was an enormous amount of energy that has been going on in Dante studies really for the last 10, 15 years, looking forward to the centennial.
I see. Thank you.
I mean, I think that you wouldn't have had two monumental sets of editions without the coming of the centennial.
Yes, thank you. That's very true. That is certainly very true. Thank you. Going ahead and following what we were saying before, looking at some of the events that many actually, or the anniversary events in these past months, many conferences would not necessarily devoted entirely to Dante, but with ample sections devoted to Dante, reserve space to why, how, and what we could say, why, how, and what part of Dante's message can still talk to us. As I've already said, I always believe that Dante, like any other true classic, is an evergreen with a perennial message of justice, ethical teachings, equality, and hope, sacred or not. Naturally, I'm not saying that his religious, social, or political ideology is too core modern, or that his poem should not be placed and analyzed in the correct context, but that the poetic lesson of the Commedia crosses the ages. What are your thoughts about the attempt to validate the studying of Dante today to create a small or large niche that justifies his existence in contemporary academic culture and contemporary culture in general? Could we or should we follow specific strategies to make his works more accessible to a non-specialist public, including perhaps a good part of the academic public?
Well, first of all, I don't believe in penalizing authors or anyone for living when they lived and holding views that are part of the zeitgeist that they are in. That said, I do think that there is a profound misunderstanding of Dante that is deep in the popular culture, but things don't get deep into the popular culture without having been put there by high culture, the commentary tradition. And I do believe that Dante's, the understanding of who Dante is simply became too complexly enmeshed, as you know, as a Manzoni scholar, with statehood and with the existence of the Catholic Church and its desire to appropriate Dante for its own purposes, the state's desire to appropriate. It all became such a long, complex story, but with so much appropriation, and with every appropriation, another deformation. So that it's all the more remarkable that he can still speak as clearly as he does, but we really have to make ourselves listen. And my personal belief is the best way to do that is to pay a lot of attention to the text. And that's where the problem of accessibility is, because very few people are really going to read the entire Divine Comedy and carefully. But I think that if one does, one is surprised. If one does with an open mind. Now, let me just give you an example, a little example. Years ago, when I was researching the way that painters in their apocalypses, in their last judgments, like Giotto, and much less well known, but very, very gruesome, Taddeo di Bartolo, looking into these matters, how they showed, for instance, how they depict the Lussuriosi. And I was reading an essay by art historians on Giotto, where just in passing, with respect to the sinners, the Lussuriosi, who are to the left of Satan in Giotto's Last Judgment, referring to the women hanging from their hair and the man that the devil is going after his penis with a little pincer, they just put in passing, surely Dantean contrapassi. And this started me on a train of thought, because those were two scholars who said that. But the reason they just put that in is because it's so deep in the popular imagination. You find some gruesome punishment, of course it's a Dante and contrapasso. But it's such an interesting one to say that, because in fact, there is no sexualized torment anywhere in the Divine Comedy. And yet he has quite a remarkable treatment of lusuria in Inferno, but it doesn't go to where the popular imagination, not of the 5th century only, but of his own time goes. He just simply doesn't go there. So thinking in terms of how Dante's imagination does not tend, nothing can be said in an absolute blanket way, but does not tend to be drawn to the stereotypes. I actually think Petrarch is much more drawn to the stereotypes, by the way.
That's interesting. Thank you. Well, I mean, actually, I tend to agree with you about that, about everything you said. And I know exactly what paintings you're talking about, even the Taddeo di Bartoli one, and so on and so forth. Very gruesome, you're right. Utilized, by the way, during the sermons in church to scare people by the priest. And so, of course, they had to be gruesome. That was not exactly Dante's intention, you're right.
Well, at least not in his treatment of the sin that perhaps preachers care about more than any other, which is lust.
Yes. If going towards your interest in Dante, I mean, asking you a little bit to speak about what really triggered your interest in Dante and why you are studying Dante in a certain way. In an autobiographical statement, you mentioned a newspaper interview, you mentioned that you discovered Dante when you were 13, while reading T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. You were captivated by the epigraph in Italian that Eliot left in Italian. You asked your father, the writer and poet Antonio Barolini, who was the author of this epigraph, and he revealed Dante. From then on, you knew what and who was going to be the main subject of your literary studies. It does not go unnoticed, at least not to me, knowing what you wrote about Dante, that you came across Dante through your interest in Eliot. And this is already a great clue to understand your scholarly approach to Dante, as it derives from reading another poet who claimed that Dante's poetry has a special communicative gift and reaches even those who may not understand the meaning or the many allusions of his poetry. In what measure there is a correlation between the young reader and entranced by those lines and the more mature scholar who explores the complex intellectual world represented by Dante's comedy?
Andrea, I'm so touched that you did the research to discover that story. Well, it's a story that means so much to me because 13 is a long time ago, and I'm not blessed with one of those memories of my life that is full of such tactile and clear experiences. So I feel very blessed to have this one, really also because of the connection to my father, because it's the only real way. He had died, before I started graduate school. So he did not know what I was going to embark on. I mean, I think that I was inclined toward lettere it was clear, but not really more than that. So those verses, as you said, Eliot cites them without any identification. He puts them up at the top of Prufrock. I was entranced by Prufrock also. I was going around reciting it out loud. The melancholy appealed to my 13-year-old sense of how sad everything was. So that's where but then what were these verses? There was no name, there was no identification. And I read them out loud and I kept reading them, and they were so fascinating. They were so beautiful. They were so mysterious. They were so entrancing. Those verses really are verses that say, there is more in your philosophy more on heaven and earth than your philosophy ever dreamt of, right? Those verses are saying, they Guido da Montefeltro, once we put them into context, is saying, oh, of course I'll answer you, because you can't possibly be going back up to earth. And so there's also in them this sense of how we never really know what the situation is that we're in, and we really, et cetera, et cetera. So fascinating, fascinating verses. And in answer to the question, what connection do I have to that person? I can say only that I hope to stay a person who wants to keep learning and who wants to keep being entranced. I believe in the beauty of the verses. I know I was captured by their beauty before I had any way to understand. And I hope I stay alive to that, and I keep being able to learn something.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Well, so after all, Eliot was right that people are captured by Dante's lines, even if they don't understand immediately what he means.
And that's a beautiful point. That's a beautiful point you're making. You're basically saying Eliot is performing his own theory of Dante as an author by putting those verses there and letting them do their magic.
Yeah, it is amazing, but it does work. It does work. Thank you. Mentioning another famous poet and writer, more known perhaps as a novelist as a poet. I mean, Borges has famously written that Dante captures and renders a character. This was in an interview on Dante and the Divine Comedy, and he said, well, you know, what's Dante's gift? Dante can capture a character with 20 or 30 lines, and you know everything you need to know about that character. While a modern novelist needs many pages, if not an entire novel, to do that. This is one of the best tributes, I believe, to Dante's poetry and his highly visual synthetic gift. But I also believe that this is also a wise warning on the part of a great author like Borges about how to read Dante. That is, we have to read him very, very carefully, as each line, precisely because of his synthetic style, is so dense and therefore unchains so many different meanings and ethical and historical evocations. Now, the question may sound a little bit provoking, but do you believe, not provoking in your regards, in regards to perhaps the rest of the scholarship, but do you believe that most of the scholarship on Dante has listened to or followed or understood this lesson that Borges is talking about?
So with respect to the lesson of how synthetic the poetry is,
well, I
think the lesson that you're getting at is the lesson of humility. Because yes, when the poetry is so dense with significance in such a compact way, we have to accept. And, you know, honestly, we all have the tendency to think that we have stated the best interpretation of a certain passage. But the truth is, even though I'm not a big fan of the whole allegorical issue, Dante is polysemous, just in the way that you say. His language can scaturire, can give off just so many avenues that you can take something in the direction, in this direction, or you can take it in that direction. And so it's just as you say, it's an incredibly compressed language. The more that you try to unpack it, the more it gives and the more solicitations it gives you. And you can barely contain yourself. You get so excited. Should I go this way? Should I go that way? So we have to be humble. We have to be humble and all of us do our best to not always think we have the only possible reading. That would be one thing. The other thing, as you said, I don't know if Borges really said that Dante tells us all that we need to know. I don't know. Were you paraphrasing? Was that because one of the things that I think is one of Dante's great geniuses is that he tells us less than we want to know. And consider Boccaccio, who expands. He takes Francesca and he expands. That's someone who's trying to tell us everything we could possibly want to know. Dante is a magnificent genius at reticence. He says enough to give you a profound insight, but not to tell you everything. And in general, he's very good at reticence. I don't know about what you think about Tasso having God speak in the Gerusalemme Liberata, but I think it's probably a mistake. And it's the kind of mistake that Dante never makes. So there's a certain kind of, and that's something he learned. You know, there is a moment in the Canzone Giovanile Donne che avete, where a voice speaks, "O malnati," we don't know who it is, but you know, we have the song of the angel Gabriel. Certainly we have language of angels. We don't have, except maybe dir subsisto, but that's a description of the moment of creation, where that subsisto is God's language, but he's not speaking in the diegesis of the poem. And that's just one example of a certain kind of Borgesian reticence that I think is part of the genius of the Divine Comedy. It's actually short for a long poem, right? I mean, yes. Just Dante's whole opera is short for his, compared, say, to Boccaccio's or Petrarca's, which go on and on and on.
No, I agree with you very much. And actually, I think that's exactly what Borges meant when he says he has a gift in 20 or 30 lines. He tells you everything he needs to say. He doesn't tell you, basically Dante is elliptical. This is what he's saying. And I agree with you, the reticentia, or the ellipsis, I mean, but
it's a very powerful, it's so powerful.
And all great authors are actually, they have this gift. They make you think, or artists for that matter. I mean, I agree.
They make you decide how the person, exactly.
You, yes, and that's why there is so many. Each line, I think, can evoke so many different meanings and so many different evocations. So I agree with you that this is exactly the key. And sometimes my point is that perhaps maybe some scholars, sometimes even famous scholars and very good scholars, I don't deny that at all, they actually maybe don't realize they overwrite, overinterpret, overspend words sometimes in trying to not understanding and not respecting this aspect.
I do believe that Dante has been buried under a secolare commento that has both under and overinterpreted him, and in ways that have not been useful. And that for a scholar, I consider it one of my responsibilities to learn as much as I can about the reception of a passage or that I'm working on, but then to unlearn it, because it comes with so many presuppositions, overdetermined ideas that frankly, I think it's going to limit what you can see in the poem to remain within those parameters.
Thank you. I agree with you. Going ahead with your works on Dante, in your first two books on Dante, I consider they are true watershed in Dante studies, as they changed the course of the critical river, I believe. And your scholarly approach has always been extremely well informed of the preceding scholarship, as well as respectful of philological matters and of the context. Nonetheless, your books make no mystery that you intend to bring to the surface Dante's intricate universe through the literary value of his word, without letting any critical overdetermination to stand in the middle. You discuss the aesthetic, philosophical, ethical, and historical reflections with an open eye and ear, without overlooking the fundamental matter that Dante chose poetry as his artistic medium. We were just discussing that. Why do you think most scholarship on Dante still prefers a traditional approach which focuses on the recognition of external element, certainly fundamental to understand his historical and cultural formation, but not necessarily conducive to appreciate the totality of Dante's aesthetic intentions, his poetry?
Can you tell me what you mean by external element?
For instance, the importance of recognizing the sources, the importance of recognizing that Dante is a man of his time and lives in a specific context and specific historical time, and therefore all the references that he makes as basically the main event of the critical interpretation, rather than trying to recover this through the analysis of the verses, forgetting at times that we are reading a poem after all, and not necessarily not an essay of history or a philosophical essay.
It's a very it's a great conundrum to me. Maybe it is a certain amount of intimidation at the amount of scholarship, the amount of commentary tradition. I'm going to come at this a little obliquely and start with pedagogy. I've had so many Italians in particular ask me, how should we be teaching Dante? How do we get the young to love him? And I say, let him speak for himself. Let him tell the story. They will be captured by it. Just let it work. Let the narrative work. I'm going to do a parenthesis within that, if I may. In May of 2021, I received an invitation from an editor for the Paul Grave Online Encyclopedia for the Possible, asking me if I would write the article on the Divine Comedy. And I wrote back and I said, what are possible studies? I never heard of them. Would I have to learn about them? Or can I just really go with what this brings to my mind? And he said the latter. And he also said that the reason that they approached me was then evident in their table of contents, which included authors like Isaac Asimov and Tolkien, but not Virgil, and not, for me, perhaps the greatest poet of the possible, who is Ovid. But I didn't want to tell them that they were missing out. I was just trying to understand. And the main thing about this is that they have nothing to do with our world. They're not even mostly literary scholars as possible studies. It seems to be a lot in psychology. But it was very interesting. I did take on the assignment, which I normally would never have done in May of 2021. I had so much else to do. But it was just too interesting to me to realize that they had seen a great fantasy writer, a great version of someone who can create a possible world that is so compelling that the reader can't get out and doesn't want, has all that experience that the readers have who read certain kinds of science fiction or fantasy. That to me was very important, because Dante is, I believe, our premier creator of a virtual reality. And the reception shows us that critics don't read critically, because they read within the fiction created by the author, who is so damn good at making that virtual reality. As a lover of reading, I love 19th century English novels. I am an avid reader and rereader of Trollope, because he creates such astounding, fully formed possible worlds that I can sort of try to inhabit. As a scholar, though, I try to say, how did Dante make this? Not let's believe it. How did he make it? How did he use language to persuade us to believe, to suspend our disbelief in the way that we do? And I think that the great tool that we always have is to read the text with enormous care, and that's such a humble tool. It seems like you're not saying anything of any importance. But since you mentioned Dante's Poets, my first book, that was before I really got into let's say, the methodological issues that make the Undivine Comedy a more complex situation. But even in Dante's Poets, when I look at the issue of Virgilio, I do it from a narratological point of view. And that whole story of how Virgilio is loved on the one hand, but undermined on the other, and how Dante coordinates those two in which has an extraordinary effect on the reader. That whole story comes entirely from the text, just taking the text literally. If you look at many commentaries, I'm not talking about today's commentaries, but the commentaries we would have been looking at as students, you never see anything but that Dante feels nothing but the greatest filial adoration for Virgilio. Well, nonetheless, in Inferno 12, I think it is, he says to Virgilio, "You who can conquer all things, forque demon duri, but for those devils who didn't let us get through the gates of Dis." Well, what kind of comment is that to make? Why are you saying that to your beloved author? Oh, because you're about to show more and more and more occasions in which Virgilio is going to be unable to do something, right? So in many ways, the answer to me has always been follow the text. It's not a sexy answer, but then, as I said, it got more complex with the Undivine Comedy because I was basically devising a methodology, and that involved, but you know, much of this goes back to the reception and to paying attention to the reception. And if I can share an anecdote from my own life, my first Dante essay is called Bertrand de Born and Sordello, The Poetry of Politics in Dante's Comedy, and it was published in PMLA in 1978. One of the readers' reports said, and I have to go find this because I did keep it, why doesn't she simply say that Bertrand is in hell because he's bad and Sordello is in purgatory because he's good? That could seem too simplistic to tell us anything, but I don't think so. I think it actually gives us an insight into the way that the thematic structure of the Divine Comedy overdetermines the reader's response. So that, what's there to say? He's in hell because he's bad. He's in purgatory because he's good. And that, again, is reading entirely within the fiction and not even giving any thought to, well, why? What are the choices here? What are the authorial choices? Which is what the title, The Undivine Comedy, was meant to refer to, that it was a man who was doing this, a human being. And all the more credit to him that he could make a possible world that we all tumble into. Like Alice going down that rabbit hole.
Thank you. This was very, very clear and very enlightening to me. And as you say, the Undivine Comedy, as a matter of fact, you already answered a question that I want to ask you about the book. So in a sense, you anticipated. It always, I know that there have been some criticism of people who believe that it's impossible to read Dante without theology, but you never mentioned, you never meant to read Dante without theological references. You just meant exactly what you're saying now, that Dante is an author, and therefore we have to remember that. And a little bit.
May I say something on that point, Andrea? Yes. Honestly, I was so naive. I thought that I was going to be criticized. I thought that detheologizing was going to earn me some criticism. But you know what I thought that was going to be? The book came out in 1992. I thought, oh my God, they're all going to say, I'm such a copycat because l'ho foggiato on Derrida's deconstruction, which it clearly is in a way, right?
Yes.
So I thought that was going to be the sophisticated criticism I was going to get. And I was very worried about that. Instead, what I got was, oh my God, she's against theology. Honestly, that threw me for a loop. It really did.
I can only imagine that. Well, it was too bad for them, because that's not what you intended and you wrote. You explained that very, very well.
I think it says something about our field in the 1980s and 90s, though.
Yes, I agree with you. I agree with you. We mentioned this, and we mentioned this, both of us, at the beginning of our conversation, but I wanted to ask you, you wrote specifically in several occasions, in several essays, that Dante breaks the code on most of the conventions of his time, and I fully agree with you. Would you, conventions that actually, and you mentioned Dante's modernity, would you exemplify about some of these aspects, or what you mean when you say that Dante breaks the code of conventions?
Okay, I don't remember the essay to which you are the specific usage that you don't care about that. I was just curious where
you basically, it is my assumption from reading you, but also in an interview to Corriere della Sera, I think very recently, I think a year and a half ago, you said that you mentioned, the journalist asked you a question that was formulated in a way that actually did not really require this answer. So that was surprising. Why do we read Dante today? Is Dante still important? Does still speak to us, and so on and so forth? The usual thing what we were discussing before. I mean, why, how can we read Dante today and stuff like that? And you replied, Dante breaks the, you were speaking in Italian. So, and so you said Dante breaks the code and the conventions of his times. I think basically you explain this very well in your essays, the modernity of Dante, when you talk about Dante in regards to many of the issues that we talk today, in a sense, and why Dante speaks to us still nowadays.
So I think you're going to try this in many layers. I think, first of all, Dante speaks to us because he tells, as I already said, an extraordinary story, and extraordinarily well. So that you don't have to be a person versed in all the intricacies in order to feel the force of that story. And I'm going to just, something that came in my mind thinking about the difference between Dante and Petrarca is the basic plot of the Divine Comedy. Whether we're in a religious structure or not in a religious structure, the religious structure is important because it is a way ultimately of saying, I can see the ultimate distillation of this person's soul, which is the other correlative to what Borges was saying. So synthetic, but I can be so synthetic because I have this perspective that I've gotten to see the person in their final destination, and therefore I have a different kind of opportunity to distill that character. But taking that part out, what we have is a picaresque voyage in which you get to talk to person after person after person. Le vite spirituali ad una, as in Paradiso 33. That's important. That's the actual backbone. It's the narrative backbone, is that it's encounters. It's a picaresque journey, and it's all about other people. It's all about other people. I mean, how one could not get interested in such an extraordinary slice of life as is put in front of the reader in the Divine Comedy, as compared to the constant looking inside, right? So that's at the simplest level. I think that goes back to why it's included in that Paul Graving encyclopedia with Asimov and Tolkien. People respond to that, and they respond to having a full-fledged virtual reality composed for them, around them, in which they can be. So that's one thing. Then, if you could remind me now, where was I heading with this? Oh, I can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Dante breaks the convention of his times, basically.
Okay. So I first started thinking about that from a very intellectual high point of view, in terms of the Paradiso and the way that Dante, and this is a big part of the Undivine Comedy, the chapters on the Paradiso, which to me were very exciting to write. The Paradiso is always presented as boring. To me, what was so extraordinary about the Paradiso that I try to bring out in those chapters is that you can actually see Dante oscillating in terms of, am I going to try to present God as similitude, unity, oneness, or am I going to embrace the great, great world of multiplicity and difference that I can't help but be attracted to? And to me, that is the great story of the Paradiso. And that's a very exquisitely intellectual problem. But later, and this is what I focused on for the journalist, but I'm giving you the intellectual story of how I got there. Later, I realized that there were social correlatives to that love of multiplicity that I had already tried to analyze in a narratological way as an intellectual quest. And the great dubio of the Commedia, the great dubio of the Paradiso is certainly, for me, in una parte più e meno altrove. Well, if you have in una parte più e meno altrove, you have difference. He's on the one hand always saying, oh, no, 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 we're going to get rid of this mortal disaguaglianza because we want to be all together, igualmente, being turned by la rota che igualmente mossa. But, you know, eventually what happened is I came to the understanding that that idea of multiplicity is present in the poem, not just in a philosophical way, but also in a social way. And this is what I was alluding to earlier when I was talking about the absence of sexualized torture. Actually, that's just a spia. It's just a way to think about what Dante does with certain kinds of characters, the kinds of characters who in the contemporary codes of his time would always be the ones you'd associate with sexualized torture. Let's just take Francesca da Rimini. The fact that that treatment of lusuria is so psychological and philosophical, in fact. Lusuria is defined in Inferno 5 as these are those I peccatori carnali che la ragion sommettono al talento, right? Who subordinate their reason to their desire. That's a entirely philosophical description. He never talks about fornication. He never talks about the things the preachers go crazy about. And the result is that, to make a long story short, eventually, if you continue to think about Francesca and you take her out of the overdetermined grid of if it's in hell, the person's bad, if it's in the other part of the poem, the person is good. What I eventually got to is that Dante gives an enormous amount of attention to the personhood, in a way dignifying the personhood of a dynastic wife. I did this in a historical way, there are wonderful scholars. I didn't do the historical archival work. It had all been done in the early part of the 20th century by people like Torraca in specialized journals where there'd be something on Francesca, tons of biographical material, not tons, no, let me take away tons, but enough to know, for instance, that Francesca's name never appears in any historical document except for the will of her father-in-law, Malatesta da Verrucchio, the founder of the Rimini clan of bosses that took over Rimini. Malatesta da Verrucchio puts her in his 1311 will just to say what should happen to her dowry, to just dispose of her dowry. And she's named there. That's the only time she's named. In other words, Francesca da Rimini, Francesca Polenta in Malatesta would have been lost to history were it not for the Divine Comedy. In Inferno 5, she speaks the whole time. She speaks, she talks about having also been a reader, as we know. But my point is, why is it that she, being damned in the fiction, is more important than being made alive to history, which is what Dante did. Dante made her live for generations of other human beings who would never have heard of her. We all heard of Virgil. Dante doesn't make Virgil alive. He gives Virgil a new life. But we never would have heard of Beatrice. We never would have heard of Francesca. We never would have heard of Pia. We never would have heard of Picarda. These are all people we never would have heard of. And it doesn't matter ultimately to me. Okay, he damns her in his fiction. To me, the fact that he makes her live in our minds is infinitely more important. So that is a code breaking, it seems to me.
That is definitely a code breaking. Thank you. This is a wonderful example that you just gave us. I mean, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. And we just have to reflect and think about another like Dante, how many things he does that we take for granted in a sense. This is wonderful. One last question that I ask has to do, of course, kind of an inevitable question. Petrarch's name came up already a few times, of course, as I imagine it would come up during this conversation. And this may be a little bit of a longer question because I want to explain myself so you understand the question. In a sense, we know that Dante becomes immediately a reference point to be admired or to be despised, but impossible to ignore, to be ignored. Particularly those who distance themselves from Dante's poetics, in a sense, based on sympathy and Dante's poetics, which is based on sympathy and empathy, as well as on a search for a possible solution to human sufferings. Particularly those poets must face more or less openly his message. I'm thinking, of course, Petrarch, I've already mentioned him, and his inability to follow Dante's lessons, his unwillingness and inability to follow Dante's lesson. I think in particolare ho solo pensato sui più deserti campi, Rerum Vulgarium 35, probably the most famous sonnet with the opening one of the Rerum Vulgarium Fragmenta. In fact, we could consider it a sonnet manifesto. We see Petrarch, and I see in the sonnet Petrarch's suffered response to Dante's project based on search and hope. The last terzina of the sonnet, the very famous lines, ma pur si aspre vie né si selvagge, cercar non so, ch'amor non venga sempre ragionando con meco e io con lui. There is an immediate reference to the first canto of the Inferno, when Dante talks about the selva selvaggia e aspra e forte, ma pur si aspre vie né si selvaggia. Dante talks, of course, about the selva selvaggia e aspra e forte, che nel pensiero rinnova la paura, tante amara che poco più è morte, ma per trattare del ben che io trovai, dirò delle altre cose che avevo scorte. That is, they both face an existential dilemma, but one solves his moral solitude through ecumenical empathy, nostra vita, and dares to search outside of himself, del ben che io trovai. The others instead turns into a self-investigation that leaves no room for a different result, e io con lui, ragionando con me, e io con lui, that is with amore, of course. In other words, Dante's spiaggia deserta becomes a terrain of exploration, as finding a new way implies, because finding a new way implies that the will to search and hope to succeed. Petrarch's deserti campi stay as such, deserted and empty of a possible solution different than an internal anguish. Both messages are extremely modern, in my view, of course, and in everybody's view, I suppose. And yet one is usually preferred to the others, Petrarch's one, because it is deprived of the religious infrastructure. We were talking about that before. In a sense, borrowing your own words and your own book, Petrarch's view is naturally de-theologized, while Dante's creativity is engulfed in it and intimidates the reader who cannot de-theologize the comedy and see through its structure. Do you perceive the fundamental divarication in Western culture as one of the main issues about accepting Dante as a modern author. Is this what keeps Dante, this rejection since the beginning from Petrarch, is this the first sign of a rejection in regards to Dante as being a medieval and not a modern author?
Oh, well, Petrarch was incredibly astute at fashioning himself, and he fashions himself. He knows what he's got to deal with, that he knows this monumental poet, that he comes. Remember, I just say this really for our audience. Remember that these two people were on the planet at the same time. When we call one the Middle Ages and one the Renaissance, we lose track that this is a very compressed and extraordinary moment in Italian history. So Petrarch knew that he had to undo what Dante did. And in one sense, you could say that he goes back to the model of the courtly lyric as it was in the troubadour period, only makes it infinitely more focused on the self, even than those earlier poems. But undoubtedly, I'm sure that you're right. I believe that Petrarch intuited that what was going to be most challengeable or least absorbable or least desirable about the Divine Comedy would be that religious superstructure, right? Though I do want to add in parentheses, because I don't want any of your audience to feel that they can't de-theologize. All they do is have to say to themselves, loosen your reading from the overdetermined grid of damnation versus salvation. Just don't let that govern your hermeneutic assumptions. Just as I just said with Francesca, then you can see more things. That's all that is. It's a simple proposition, and I don't want any of your readers to fall into that trap that Petrarch made such able use of, and Croce is just one more example of, which is, of course, we can't read this poem because the poem is all covered by that superstructure. I just don't think that's really the case, but it has been very effective, so it must be the case to some degree. So then the answer that I would give you is, and I consider Petrarch a very great poet. I actually love Petrarch, but I have to give it to Dante because of what you just said, ecumenical empathy. The other, caring about the other. This brings me back to those breaking the code issues. And I don't want to, just speak for our times where everything is through a social lens, but I might as well. I mean, Dante writes poems also to women. He has women as interlocutors. He writes lyric poems in which he tries to educate women, saying things like, don't do this because then you will perish and so forth. Now that's quite paternalistic, but to have a female as an interlocutor is a statement about possibility, going back to that possibility. It's not in Petrarch. Petrarch never addresses a woman, ever, anywhere, but certainly not in the Rerum Vulgarium Fragmenta. His interlocutors are few, and they're all men carefully chosen, part of his world, his coterie. Petrarch is not about expanding either, as you know from Contini, the lexicon, which becomes reduced to this extraordinary, distilled and magnificently beautiful, very limited palette, whereas Dante's lexicon grows and grows and grows and grows and encompasses strange words, odd words, words that take us into the texture of what it was to live then, to be alive then. I have to go with that one.
This is a wonderful answer. Thank you. Thank you very much, Teodolinda, for this wonderful conversation. And I hope finally I will see you soon, maybe at the Ragusa Foundation in an event in person, who knows when, but hopefully soon enough.
I would love to see you at the Ragusa Foundation in person, hopefully in 2022.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Teodolinda. Thank you.